Hello, Culture Matters podcast. I'm so excited to introduce you to our guest. Before I do that, here's a quote just for this episode. When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. Viktor Frankl. Our guest today has a wide and deep breadth of experience educating entrepreneurs and alike, working in venture capital, background in organization and economics, real estate. They are not only a ball of energy and inspiration for me, but they have become a fast friend and have had hundreds of people work for and with them over the years. I could go on, but today we have the one and only Rob McCord on the Culture Matters podcast. Teacher, speaker, entrepreneur, investor. Thanks for coming on the Culture Matters podcast. I've been wanting to do this for some time. I have a million questions.
Absolutely, Jay. I'm delighted to get more time with you. I always get lit up when I'm talking to you. Feel like we can conquer the world whenever we talk. Yeah. What's up?
And I was preparing for this, and I was reminded that you were a student of organization in your undergrad. You were interested in organization
Yeah. I
in
mean, there's
economics.
one of the things, I was born during the Paleozoic era, right? So I'm a fitness nut, but I'm also 67 years old, right? I'm not young. And I think one of the things that can happen when you start to age out and you're only working because you want to. One of my friends said retirement just means working only because you want to, right? But of course, I knew a lot of wealthy venture capitalists who could have retired when they were 35, but I still kind of like that image. And but I realized as I got deeper into my 60s, there was a little bit of returning to the basics, like my early interest in social sciences, my early interest in Civil War history, my early interest in self-help, right? I mean, I was a kid as a little boy. My parents were both professors, but I did really badly in school at first. And my brother was really brilliant. They were really brilliant. And I was like, I can't be as stupid as the teachers are telling me they are. And it wasn't, I started studying to figure it out. And my mom sent me to a self-help, not a self-help, a study habits course
Wow.
that was designed for incoming jocks. So I was always sort of an athlete, but it was incoming jocks to college. So these were people who were underachieving academically, but they were great lacrosse players or wrestlers or whatever coming into Drexel, right? So I'm coming into the ninth grade. So I'm a chunk younger and I'm looking at these bigger mesomorphic guys, right? And, but we go in and we have 4 or 5 hours a day of like being taught how to go to college. And I'm telling you, first they diagnosed me as being dyslexic. Only
Wow.
later did I realize I had ADD. And once I was taught how to study, how to chunk up my classes, how to read with questions, how to interview or even interrogate your professors, because they basically will tell you what they're going to ask in the test, how to show up during office hours. I got straight A's after that. And then,
Whoa.
bluntly, frankly, I went, I got braces and then I got contact lenses. So I went from like at age 14 being labeled as an athletic weirdo loser to 16 being labeled as an athletic, you know, captain of a team, student body president type, right? And I
Wow.
probably got a little too concerned about other people's impressions because that turnaround was, and then later, of course, I ran for office, and there you have to be concerned with other people's impressions. But the good part about it is self-help really worked for me. For me, I love thinking about what's worth working on, then thinking about how do you plan, and then trying to execute the plan. So Eisenhower, a partner of mine in the venture capital industry, once told me that Eisenhower has said, the plan is nothing, planning is everything. And I thought about it. I thought, well, every once in a while, I get a plan, I work the plan, and the plan actually works. 9 out of 10 times, the plan doesn't work. And then you have to revisit and go, which part of the plan didn't work? Where are we going now? But
Mm.
having a process and holding yourself accountable is obviously really important. And I feel like you drill into that
Wow.
whole kind of approach to the world from so many different interesting angles. I really love
Oh, thank
talking
you.
with you about your work and the people you know.
Thank you. I actually, for those that are listening that may be in that position where, well, actually, no, I want to go back. At that time, did you did you think you could learn before you took that class?
Yes, in part because my mom was fantastic at saying, you don't need to take this negative feedback from the teachers. Don't let a bad teacher get in the way of learning. And I went from being in the slow reading group and struggling to read.
Wow.
The first book I read was like a biography of the Wright brothers, and for some reason I decided biographies were what I was going to read. So in the fourth grade, I read the autobiography of Clarence Darrow. It took me like all summer, and I had to have a dictionary, but I was like, well, maybe I'll be Clarence Darrow when I grow up. So I was already really ambitious, even though I was like getting C's and having, and still stuck in the slow reading group. So I sort of had this pent up competitiveness
Hmm.
about me, and also because one, there's some data that the thing that's most correlated. Now, this is back when I was a kid. Um, the the data was that your score in your SATs was most correlated to how many books were in the house when you were a little kid.
Whoa.
And
Really?
now, obviously, now everybody's got
Wow.
these iPads and things. But I grew up in a house just covered with books, wall to wall books. And I say that now and I'm embarrassed. There are no books in my shot here. Well, there's some books over my right shoulder there, um, but anyway, I was so covered in words that I think I became unusually verbal, but I couldn't read well. I could only speak well. And I still tend to be somebody who takes a verbal brief. So you've probably run into these people who read like the wind, but they mispronounce words. I remember I had a very well-read friend who used to say devastate, but he'd pronounce it devastate. And he's like, Andy, that word is devastate. It's like, no, it's not. I'm like, trust me, it's devastate. So I sort of knew. And, I hung out with professors. I'd go, my parents were long divorced, and I would shuttle between New York and Philly. So I'd hung out with smart people, but I just couldn't crack the code. And then that really helped me.
You got involved with venture capital and entrepreneurs. And where have you found commonalities in how entrepreneurs learn or don't learn, or what naturally like, or is it the gamut and everyone just is?
Yeah, I mean, look, in this era of influencers, there's so many people who pile assertion upon assertion, acting like they're certain. And it's like, how much of a study have you done? Okay, all right, Rob. So you invested in 43 companies out of what, 43 million entrepreneurs? Like,
Mm,
to say you know something for sure because you
mm.
noticed a pattern, it's more I like to develop a hypothesis, right?
Okay.
So I'll give you a few hypotheses. Um,
Wow, that's good.
Most of the first of all, I like to remind the average entrepreneur that the average multimillionaire is not an entrepreneur. So you don't become an entrepreneur because you want to become rich. That is, if you want to become rich, save like a chipmunk and start investing in equities before you're 19. Like, and just don't spend money, just say it's not what you earn, it's what you save. So there are tons of plumbers and HVAC workers and real estate entrepreneurs who are real estate brokers or whatever who aren't particularly entrepreneurial, but they're rich as God. There are a lot of dentists who own a bunch of buildings, right? And of course, there are corporate people who vest in equities. And 20 years later, when I was a kid, you couldn't swing a dead cat without hitting a DuPont millionaire. Because I lived near Route 52 in the southwestern corner of Pennsylvania. And so, like Joe Biden and those guys, Jack Markell's one of my favorite politicians. He was governor of Delaware. They would see my area, southeastern Pennsylvania, as part of Delaware for like political fundraising. But anyway, Route 52 was where all the DuPont executives lived. And they would sign up and they might be an engineer or whatever, and they might start working for DuPont when they were 25. And by the time they were 50, they were worth $10 million just because of equity, right? And so, there was all this
Wow.
quiet money. So a lot of times you'd run into entrepreneurs and you could just tell, like, I'm doing this to get rich. And it's like, you'd better have more reasons than that, right? And so a couple of things struck me. One is obviously you have to be more comfortable with risk than a lot of people are. A second thing is it's invaluable to have worked in understaffed situations. If somebody has never worked in a context where they have to make their own coffee, they probably aren't ready to be an entrepreneur. A third thing is they have really good instincts about what problem they're solving. Like they can really articulate either a big market in which they can shrink the cost, they shrink the spend. Like people are spending a boatload of money on this and we can reduce the spend and they have to buy it. Or this is something that's going wrong. And that now, listen, I never
Wow.
invested in Netflix, right? It's not like I can sit here and say, I helped to invent Amazon. I was an East Coast based entrepreneur. We did invest in a company called half.com, which was
Wow.
how do you spend less on something you're spending money on already? Use books. And he designed that company to be sold to eBay. So he was Josh Koppelman, probably the single smartest entrepreneur I ever had the honor of working around. He
Yeah.
also invented first round capital and, did really, he became close to Obama later in his life. And then, the guys who invented Internet Capital Group, they saw the brilliance of software plays, but they understood that we needed much more business to business sort of marketing. All this business to consumer stuff was to get buzz, but it wasn't where the market and the best use cases were. Um, and then traffic.com for a lot of people, driving in traffic is their second biggest cause of stress, second only to divorce or death
Wow.
in their.
Wow.
And so it's like if we can reduce your time in traffic, we're really creating value. And it was really fun to work with them. And of course, there were environmental implications. So we helped fund a company that ultimately planted sensors in roadsides and furthered technologies that are now embedded in the nav systems that everybody uses. Um, and so those are real problems, right? You get in the car, you'd like to be certain where to turn left and right. You'd like to know how long it'll take you to get there. These are real issues. You haven't invented a new industry. It's still the transportation industry, but it's
Yeah.
horse and buggy. It's not a bicycle, and it's not just that you're in the car. It's that you have a nav system. So those would be a couple of the things I noticed. And then, as a rule, the more successful entrepreneurs had to be good at raising capital. Because at the end of the day, just like political candidates, you often are your own best fundraiser.
So willing to take on risk. Uh, I wrote down
They
under.
they know
Oh,
what problem or need they're addressing.
well, willingness to take on responsibility for things, or to
Well,
take.
no, I would say willingness to take on risk and a clear idea of what problem they're solving or want or need they're addressing.
And you mentioned understaffed situations. That was the
Oh,
one
they
that
have to
really
be
stuck.
willing to staff themselves because you don't have enough staff at certain points when you're running a new co. And
Wow.
then you have to be usually pretty good at raising money. At least in the experiences, the early stage venture world I lived in. I mean, I wasn't saturated in Silicon Valley. I'm not going to pretend I was. I don't, I have friends who popped in that space. Yeah, but that wasn't my life.
For our listeners that aren't familiar with what venture means, what does it mean to you? How do you interpret venture capital
Well,
versus?
I do think it's a phrase that's used a little pretentiously. Sometimes people like to call themselves venture capitalists, and I think I can be a little snobby about it and say, you're really not a venture capitalist unless you're being paid to invest other people's money. So if you're a venture capitalist, and you're saying, well, I'm spending my own money or I'm looking to find a deal. You're not really a venture capitalist. You might be a business broker, you might be a fundraiser, you might be a little mini iBanker, but venture capital usually means you put together a pool of money that's provided by others and that they're literally paying for your time to find deals, invest in the deals, and usually it's thought of as blind pools of capital, right? So you put the money in and you don't even know what company you're buying. Think about it, when you buy a house, imagine just saying, hey Jay, here's $500,000. I'm going to pay you 40 grand to go find me a house. Find
Wow.
me a house, and whatever you buy, I hope it's good, right? So, and you do
Great
it,
analogy.
you would only do that if it's a house you're not going to live in. You're doing it to make money. Now, sometimes somebody will say, I'm doing it to make money and create jobs in Pennsylvania, or I'm doing this to create money and improve the environment. There may be people do put, or I'm doing this to make money and employ more women CEOs or more minority entrepreneurs. But it isn't, I'm buying a company to run myself,
Would
right?
a historical example be something like, and this is nonpartisan or something, but like a Christopher Columbus, he was going to go across and get it.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if that's a good analogy. I don't think I,
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, he was sponsored to take a particular trip. And I think it's not
oh,
a good analogy. And here's why. He thought he was going to India, right?
wow. Okay. That's
Right? And
helpful
that's
to know
that's
the
part of
context.
why we call Native Americans Indians, right? I
Wow.
mean, it's a total misnomer. So that's almost like I pay you 40 grand and say, go buy me that house. And you go buy a house that isn't that house. And I'm like, great, as long as I'm making money, I don't care that it's the house you didn't, whatever, Jay. Right? So yeah.
Hopefully
I
this
mean,
misanalogy helps really concrete the point of what it is,
right,
actually. That's
right,
helpful.
exactly.
So how about so early on in your career as an entrepreneur, or was that an entrepreneurial venture, or are you working with a firm?
Well, I was working, the Safeguard Scientifics really mentored me. And
Wow.
also, let me sketch out for your people, your listeners, because I would say right now, in addition to investing, and I try to help people with investing, and I've pivoted much more to real estate and investment properties because I don't regard myself as being up to date enough to tell people what AI to invest in or whatever. That's not my lane anymore. I mean, I was pretty good at that when I was in my 40s. I'm in my 60s now. So, investment properties in North Carolina in particular, we're making a lot of money. We have a hotel, we have inns, we have houses. That's my day job. And then I spend a ton of time both volunteering sort of for free and then charging executive comp levels to be an executive coach type in the resilience space. So, I mean, I appreciate introductions where they say, well, here's a guy, he struggled academically, but he got into Harvard and then he went to Wharton. And later in life, he taught at Wharton and at Haverford College. And he was on the lecture circuit and he ran a think tank for Al Gore and John Hines when they were senators. So he's like Harvard and Wharton and a venture capitalist, smart guy. And then he was state treasurer. But I actually like to turn pain into purpose and say, well, let's not forget to tell people that in addition to being kind of a hyper old white guy, I'm a felon, right? So part of what's happened to me is I've had
Wow.
two horrible experiences. I accidentally broke the law or may have broken the law. I certainly didn't intentionally break the law, but I pled guilty and had to serve 18 months in a minimum security prison. I mean, I taught in the GD prep program and I
Wow.
took yoga classes and I trained like a maniac. So serving in minimum security prison wasn't the hard part. Waiting 4 years for sentencing and the branding and the millions of dollars lost, that was the hard part. And boy, did I reread Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning and what you were quoting there. I mean, I love Frankl, and that led me to the field of positive psychology. It led me to the study of resilience. It led me to thinking about post-traumatic growth. So a brilliant professor in the University of Michigan
Wow.
sort of invented work there, and the Army has invested, I think, $50 million helping soldiers, pursue that. They may go through trauma, but it doesn't have to be PTSD. It might be growth. So I,
Wow.
I sort of made a real intense study of resilience and got certified in positive psychology. And I'd done a lot of turnaround work in the private equity space. And then my younger son, who had gone to Dartmouth and a whole lot of good things, he'd done a lot. He was very successful at improv, but he was having real volatility in his kind of pay the bills job space. And something weird was going on with him, and a lovely romance he had broke up. And we were trying to figure out what's going on. You're suddenly unemployed, and what's going on? What's going on? And we were starting to turn a corner, and he died of a drug overdose, just flat cocaine. And we only about 10 days before said, do you think, my ex-wife and I were like, do you think he might be using drugs? So that was an almost debilitating loss. And I would say, had I not studied the work by the University of Michigan professor who lost his daughter when she was 19, I wouldn't have had a framework in place to help me deal with that grief. So I do an awful lot around both grief and resilience and turnarounds. I deal a lot with
Wow.
executives who are trying to turn around a company, with people who are going through a sense of loss, with people who are getting ready for retirement. Sometimes the people getting ready for retirement are like, look, I got to figure out how to avoid flunking retirement and being bored. But oh, by the way, Rob, you have some good investment opportunities. What can we invest in together? So sometimes I'm on both sides of the ledger with them. And that's an advantage to coaching, frankly, versus psychotherapy is, I can coach you and you can turn right around and coach me. I could say, hey,
Yeah.
Jay, you're not doing your push-up
Yeah.
with your arms at the right angle. And you can say, hey, Rob, you're not deadlifting right. And we're coaching each other. You wouldn't do that with psychotherapy. It's just not, the rules of the road are different. So I do really love the executive coach lane as well. But finally, coming back around to venture capital, I knew that I wanted to graduate from the political world, right? I had come out of Harvard. I became a chief of staff at a very young age. I got promoted to CEO of a bipartisan think tank. I got the Wharton MBA and I hit the paid lecture circuit. So I owe Al Gore a debt of gratitude for that. And I was starting to make good money. And I thought, well, I really want to validate my union card, so to speak, the Wharton MBA. And fortunately for me, in about 1993, I said, it's time for me to move on from my years around Capitol Hill. By that time, Gore was vice president. And vice presidents have a very small bus. They take like two people with them to the White House. And I wasn't going to be in that bus, right? So I lost a big provider of juice. And similarly,
Mm.
John Hines, who was also very good to me, a moderate Republican, brilliant guy who had gone to Harvard Business School, who also liked that I'd gone to Harvard, um, he died in a tragic plane accident. He was on a plane and they were having trouble with their landing gear. And a helicopter said, "We'll take a look and see what's going on." And the helicopter sucked the plane in, and they both crashed onto a school field that, bizarrely enough, was 300 yards from where I was living in Pennsylvania. At that point in my life, my wife was writing for the Philadelphia Daily News, and I was commuting 4 days a week round trip to Capitol Hill by Amtrak,
Mm.
where I got to know, Carper, who was then a congressman, then became governor, then became senator. And so Delaware also runs deep in my veins, not just Pennsylvania, because of my train life. Um, but anyway, I'd lost both of my main mentors, and I still had 88 members of Congress, but I was like, it's not going to be fun anymore. I need to get into the business world. And I had thought I was a type maybe to work for McKinsey. I kind of liked how smart they were, and I was a writerly type. But I was told, you'll be on the road every week, 5 days a week. You'll only be home on weekends. And my wife and I were thinking we wanted to start trying to have kids. And so I thought, well, what else might be fun? And so I tunneled in. There was only one famous venture capital firm in the greater Philadelphia area that wasn't focused on biotech, and it was publicly traded. It was called Safeguard Scientifics, and it was led by a guy named Pete Musser. And great guy, very fun, playful kind of guy. And I barely knew what venture capital was. I didn't know what pre-money and post-money value was. I really did. I literally, it's the old joke. I think it was Sutton. They asked, why do you rob banks? And he said, because that's where the money is. All I could tell is my instinct was that in the 70s, being a partner in a law firm was like the cool thing to do. You could be a partner in a law firm and run for office or teach in a law, and then in the 80s, it was like you want to be a management consultant. Now I'm in the 90s, and the new thing to want to be is a VC. Like it's just sort of in the ether, right? But then as I kind of examined, I thought, this is even better than management consulting because you have a guaranteed set of clients. Those 5 to 10 entities that give you money to manage, they're guaranteeing you an admin fee for 10 years. So if
Wow.
you raise $100 million, you and your partners have a revenue stream of 20 million over 10 years back in the day. They'd call it 2 and 20, 2%. So you have a client and you have an income for a decade, right? And I'm coming out of politics where it's like, hope I have a job in 2 years, right?
Yeah.
And then in addition to that, you get to invest in companies with these brilliant people. And then if they turn out not to do well, you fire them and you hire new people. So getting to know smart people and getting to know how to find good deals and getting to know brilliant consultants who could kind of knock on the intellectual capital and the inventions and the ideas and say they're kind of, they're more out of date than they're implying in their pitch deck. So I found that I loved getting to know the consultant types. I actually loved the entrepreneurs, and I was good at the fundraising because I could learn what the narrative was. So in Pennsylvania, I was able to kind of go to some of the unions and some of the state and say, look, you guys want to be like California, but it's all big hat, no cattle. It's all talk, no action. If you don't put money to work in early stage venture, you will not have entrepreneurial companies that look like this in the greater Philly or Pittsburgh areas. It's just not going to happen. And you're not going to have them all across the state because you need a critical mass of universities, you need meds and eds. People like to have a career where they can change companies without changing parking lots. You need a critical mass. So I was able
Mm.
to start to put together that narrative. And I said, and look, no ifs, ands, or buts, being an early stage venture capitalist as a rule means you get paid less than a later stage person because a later stage person starts by managing a bigger fund. So they're getting 2% of a year of a couple billion, not of a couple 100 million,
Wow.
right? And it's no easier to do a deal when you're investing 3 million than when you're investing 30 million or 300 million. In fact, sometimes investing 300 million is less work because you're doing it with all this data and there's a formula. So I said, this is not easy to put together these funds, but we will do this for you. So I was able to use the sponsorship of Safeguard Scientifics, which at that point had a hot name, and I was able to get addressed favorably even though I was a Democrat, by the Republican governor, Tom Ridge, whom I still very much venerate. I have a ton of respect for Ridge. And he
Have,
he had, I think, a Project 2021 or something like that. And
have you found
it
that
may have
your
been Project
story?
21, but we became a piece of that. And then the Democrats started to try to veto helping us. And I had to call them and go, you guys don't remember me, but I worked in these contexts. And remember, I showed up. And they were like, oh, and they kind of said, fine, you'll do this. And then we had a big hit. We had like a $30 million hit on a $2 million investment in our first 6 months. And then we were a little bit off to the races. So I was able to help invent several venture funds, PA Early Stage 1, 2, and 3, and the Eastern Tech Fund. And I got various funding formulas. But for the people who've never been around venture capital, it's one, people who are given money to invest for others to find a certain kind of company, right? Or a certain kind of financial need or want. So they might say, well, this fund is set up to provide growth equity only for companies that have trailing $10 million years, and so you have these various niches, and then you have a mission in each case. But big picture for your listeners, I would also emphasize, think of public equity and private equity. Public equity is something that trades on public markets and is repriced usually almost daily. Private equity is not publicly traded. And guess what? tons more people are involved in private equity than they think because they own houses. So to me, real estate is just another form of private equity. Now, it tends to get broken out as a real estate fund or real estate play, but it is just another version of private equity. And I love the field of private equity because you tend to have a little more control over your destiny. You know, your Aunt Martha isn't repricing the security based on what they just heard on CNBC 5 minutes ago or what Donald Trump has muttered on a Sunday night and tweeted or whatever.
Do, do you has your has your story helped you see things that are less likely to be seen by most people? And I ask because you said school didn't come naturally, but then I learned how to do it.
Yeah,
I'm at the top, and then you said post traumatic growth. That's whoa, mind blown. I just
right.
your story helped
I
you
think
pay attention to things
I
otherwise people would
appreciate
miss.
that. I mean, first of all, to have appropriate humility. I mean, I got waitlisted at Harvard and then got in the second time I applied after taking a gap year at Trinity College in Dublin. And so I knew I'd gotten in by the skin of my teeth. So I've had the great privilege of working around a lot of people I know for a fact are kind of smarter and more academically accomplished than I am. My brother is a brilliant professor. He was a longtime chair of the philosophy department at UNC Chapel Hill. So I know what really, really smart people look and sound like. And I would say one of the great privileges I've had as somebody who I'm very driven, but I've been around a ton of smart people, exceptionally smart, and I've been around a ton of exceptionally powerful people. So, you know, I've had a couple of meetings with Donald Trump, even though I am no fan, right? I had meetings with people like Al Gore. I was at Bill Clinton's daughter's wedding. You know, of all the people I sat next to, and I found him very charming, I sat next to Anthony Weiner
Huh.
at the wedding, right?
Yeah.
So sometimes I feel like that Tom Hanks character, what's his name, where he shows up in all these weird places?
Forrest Gump.
Forrest Gump. So sometimes I feel like Forrest Gump. And another friend, a psychotherapist friend of mine, said, "Did you Epstein?" He said, "Well, did you ever go to Epstein Island? Did you ever know Epstein?" And I said, "Dude, I was never that elite. I worked for the people. You know, I'm not Prince Andrew level. I'm not Bill Clinton level. I'm not Bill Gates level. Never was close to that. But you know, I did very well in life. I could have afforded to retire at 45, and instead, I decided to run for state treasurer. We did a ton of good. We did the home energy loan program. We turned around the tuition account program. You know, I had 300 employees there. I had a blast as state treasurer. And then I delusionally thought I could be governor if I put a couple million more of my dollars in. And a richer guy put in 12 million. And then I got myself in trouble behind fundraising as I ran in the Democratic primary there. I mean, I was endorsed by the Philadelphia Inquirer, the biggest newspaper in the state, and I unwittingly broke the law. I'll tell you that story if you want, but that's how I had my first real downfall. I mean, I'd had a really rough time until I was about 14, and then from the age of 14 to about 54, life was my oyster. I mean, good things just kept happening. And then all of a sudden I had to plead guilty to a felony. And woo, that was instructive. So I'm also, how many guys have gone to Harvard and gone to prison? More than one, more than two, I admit that. But that's unusual, right? And you know, I got to sat next to a guy whom I loved. You know, he was what they call your celly, you know, an African American guy. He was a good athlete. We'd work out together. He could only read at about a fourth grade level, you know, and I'd find mystery books for him to read, murder mysteries, and that would
Wow.
help him with the vocabulary. And we'd talk, and he talked about how his dad ran away, and his mom was arrested on murder charges, and how you know, his brother was a falling down drunk, but he had built his little trucking company, but then he had gotten in trouble after he failed to get health insurance and he got cancer and he was going bankrupt and he dealt a little cocaine and got arrested.
Wow.
And so I could
Wow.
sit and go, well, this is my peer group now, right? Whereas when I was in college, Oz, right, who was alarmingly handsome, was one of my classmates, right? I
Dr.
bumped
Oz?
into him at a fundraiser, or not fundraiser, a social event when I was state treasurer. So I've just had a lot of, I've spent time with the DuPonts, and I've spent time, in a minimum security prison. I mean, not a prison cell, but because it's an open campus. But
Would you
you
say,
know,
do you believe,
I've had a lot of volatility in my life, just like in venture capital, you have a lot of volatility in your earnings.
do you believe our listeners can change their life?
Yeah. I mean, I think anybody who embraces training, which I have, I'm a certified fitness trainer, certified senior fitness trainer, certified yoga teacher. Anybody who does coaching, and I'm a certified coach, I'm certified in positive psychology, I'm
Wow.
certified in the NLP lane. Anybody who does therapy, I started graduate work getting a master's of family therapy, and I thought, I don't want to do this. I don't want to sit with people 30 hours a week. I'm too peripatetic. I like to move around. I like to do deals. I'm just going to do this about 10 hours a week. But if you embrace those activities, implicit to all of that is the idea that we can change. Now, especially when I'm dating, a brilliant woman whom I adore, I say, I don't think it's hard to change somewhere between like 8 and 18%. But you start to say you want to change more than 90%, it's pretty improbable, right? So you even want to influence each other. You wouldn't want to be in a serious friendship, let alone romance, where you're having no effect on each other. It's like, well,
Hmm.
what are you learning from each other? What are you doing that maybe you wouldn't have done if you weren't dating with or living with that person? So I think there are a lot of ways that we can change. And I also think it's provable that we can change for the worse. I mean, I think social media and screen time and junk food have made us dumber, more vulnerable, and fatter, right? So if you can change one direction, you can change in the other, right?
Hmm. How do you define resilience?
Wow. That's a good, glib question for which should have a good, glib answer, but I'm going to fail you. So I will say in the moment, it's that ability to bounce back, but it doesn't mean to bounce back to all you were. I mean, there was a brilliant woman who lost her kid. She was interviewed, I think it's called All There Is, the podcast by the CNN anchorman. Help me remember his name with the white hair. He's younger than I am.
Oh,
Anderson
Cooper?
Cooper.
Cooper? Yeah.
Yeah. So Cooper interviewed, and she's this very eloquent Jewish woman who lost her son to murder in the wake of the Gaza, that horrible thing. I mean, he was with other young people just visiting Israel, and they'd been warned, like, if you see a grenade, don't close your eyes, grab it and throw it. And he had started to do that, and it exploded and blew his forearm off, and
Wow.
managed to text his parents after his arm had been blown off and say, I love you, I'm sorry. So he thought he was going to die, probably very soon, but instead he apparently lived more than 300 days. And she has this beautiful interview with Anderson Cooper that a good friend of mine sent me. I mean, I teared up watching it, and she just said, people say you have a disorder. And she said, you're darn right. I have a disorder. My son and I died out of order. I was supposed to die before he did.
Wow.
And I found that so relieving to hear. I have a lifelong disorder now. I mean, I will every day and in the middle of every night remember that my younger son is dead. And it's incredibly painful for me. And, it's hard for me to say I'm a felon. You know, I wanted all my supporters to be nothing but proud of me. We did quantifiably $1 billion worth of good, but I was persuaded if you don't plead guilty, you've got a 95% chance of being driven into bankruptcy and having to serve something like 8 years in prison.
Wow.
Like, okay, I'm not a fool. I understand odds. Um, but I carry that burden, and I have old political friends who are like, ah, this is bullshit, man. I can't believe. And also, Rob, people don't think of you that way. They think of you as a great guy who got jammed up. Da, 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 da. Well, okay, that may be them, but when I worry like, ah, what kind of burden did I impose on my kids through the embarrassment they must have felt, about me after being proud of me. And that's another burden that I carry, every day. So I can't sit there and say, I have no regrets.
Is
I have deep regrets and I have some disorder that's related to that. But I'm also able to thrive and to help people and to savor life and to feel joy. And you can have both going on at the same time. And so much of that has to do with Frankl's fundamental argument that my mom started teaching to me before I was 6. I didn't know it. She was quoting
wow.
Epictetus, the Stoic, that the only thing you can control is how you react to things. And my mom used to say the only thing that is can't be taken from you is the way you think. They can tie your hands, they can take your material goods, but they can't take what you think. And so I was sort of raised into that Stoic tradition, and I feel like Viktor Frankl really brought that attitude into the psychotherapeutic realm very productively. And then positive psychology sort of has expanded that to ask the question, what research tips and tools are out there that we can work with in order to thrive, not just to overcome our mental health disorder. And notice you can have a mental health disorder and still thrive, you know? And that's helped me a great deal, and I love trying to help others and have had some good experience helping others with that.
Are you of the belief that the that 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 the adversity becomes actually that is the value? Is that
I I think all of us have a chance to turn pain into purpose. Um, but you have to do it mindfully. I mean, I definitely buy into a lot of the kind of Buddhist assertions. I mean, I like to point out to people because I'm a playful skeptic. Like, look, remember, Buddha abandoned his family. So don't just quote Buddha and tell me he had to be right about everything. Because I don't think you can be right about everything, have a family, and leave your family and just abandon them. That's the wrong thing to do. And I've had friends, and we've talked about this, the idea of only being calm and present. Now, sometimes you want to let yourself be gripped by an emotion, whether it's deep sadness or ecstasy. But the skill of mindfully being able to let go and become much calmer and just present and in this moment is a skill worth cultivating. Um, and I think that mindful approach to like, okay, this what happened is awful. How do I now turn that into something better? I'm not saying it's net positive. I'll never wake up and go, it's good that I felonized my life or that my son died. It's not going to be a net good. But I've helped hundreds upon hundreds of people who've been what they call justice system involved, Um, and I've had a, opportunity now to help other people who've lost their kids, especially to drug overdoses. And no two experiences are identical, by the way. So
wow.
it isn't a I know how you feel. It's just kind of like I have something in common with you, but tell me how you feel. And then, sort of almost talking about differences is often very comforting. So a lot of it is you have to be mindful of it. And I think that the research out of the University of Michigan says the same thing. You study it and you focus on the fact that you were resilient. You celebrate the fact that you recovered, that you escaped that time is giving you progress, and also that you can be present with the knowledge that it happened. You don't have to escape focus on it as a set of facts in order to feel okay. Um, Another assertion, when I was studying to be a yoga teacher that is, I think, Buddhist derivative is emotion is the physical presentation of a thought. So you can have a very negative thought, but if you don't kind of get gripped by it, you don't necessarily feel sad. You might be thinking about a sad thing. Think about the difference between watching a TV show and somebody is murdered in the show in Law and Order or whatever, versus
Yeah.
you imagining that same thing happening to you. And so, there can be a focus on an event with degrees of separation and identification, but it literally, that identification finds physical expression. And there's some very interesting psychological research about what they call somatic therapy, how you store emotions in your body, how markers of inflation, I'm sorry, markers of inflammation vary with your emotions. So when you're feeling fear or anxiety, you get a rise in certain markers of inflammation. And when you're feeling joy or awe, you get especially awe, you get a decline in those markers. And that's somatic, right? That's in your body.
Let's say our listener is at the beginning of a new beginning right now, that however it feels like the end. And they're listening to you right now. What do you say to them? They're at the beginning of a new beginning, but it feels like
Right.
the end. They're about to hit
So,
they're about to
for,
end this. They're not going to
so there are
listen.
a couple of things. One, uh, find partners with whom you can be vulnerable and talk about what's going on. And, look, I've had a lot of positions of power, and I do not encourage people who are in leadership positions to immediately, or, tell the truth, but you don't want to be fully disclosing. You don't want to say, I'm very nervous right now, or I just had a fight with my wife, or, that's not what you're there for. You're at the head of and that's why you shouldn't start a speech by saying, please forgive me, I hate public speaking. That's a terrible way. I've coached a lot of people on how to give a speech, right? And that is, you do not want to start by saying, I suck at public speaking, right? And the people are there rooting for you. So similarly, you do want to be able to be vulnerable, but you got to find the right context. So find people with whom you can be vulnerable. I do, I'm nowhere near being Catholic, but I think that that is a benefit of confession, right? And having a friend, a peer, a family member, the support groups of like AA, these are all about allowing yourself to be vulnerable and disclosing about what's going on. That's item one. Item two is 100% keep a gratitude journal. The worse you feel, the more valuable it is to take out a pen.
Wow.
It's one of the world's older technologies. Just a pen and handwrite on the left three things for which you're grateful, and on the right, why. And now you'll be tempted to try to make it like an essay where you take the most important, I'm most grateful for my health, and then I'm grateful for God, and then I'm grateful. No, 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 no. I want you to write down something that allows you to associate with a specific memory, right? So you might write down today toast. This morning I had great hot toast with butter on it. Because when you remember a specific warm memory, your brain lights up as if it were happening again. And usually you get tempted to write down more than three things, and usually you end up writing down somebody's name. But you don't just want to write down Jay Duran, because he's a great and wise guy and a brilliant consultant. Those are descriptions. If I write down Jay, I want to say, a specific memory. We had fun with the podcast, or we were laughing when we were talking about insurance or but it's got to be a real memory. And once you can start teaching yourself to feel gratitude, you can't feel gratitude and depression at the same time. And literally every day I was in prison, I kept a gratitude journal. I wouldn't let myself go to sleep unless I wrote down at least three things. And I was amazed every single time I wrote in it, it lifted my spirits.
What does it feel like to help other people now?
Oh, and one last thing, figure out something you want to learn.
Oh,
So whatever is going on, intentionally learning helps with resilience. And I make these points because I don't think they're commonly enough made. There are 15 other points I could make for you, but I think being told you have to keep a gratitude journal, you have to have somebody in your life you can be disclosing to, and you really need to be trying to learn something again. I think that's one reason why a lot of seniors get depressed is they stop trying. They stop trying to learn and they stop associating with, and when they say, what's going on with you? It's like, oh, they call it the organ recital. My back hurts, my kidneys are bad. It's like, no, I mean, what's really going on with you? What's new in your world? Well, I feel badly because my son hasn't called in the last 2 weeks or whatever, right? I'm feeling a little down. I'm feeling a little mopey, real authentic stuff, right? Um, so yeah. So those would be three things. So back to what were you asking? I'm sorry I interrupted.
First of all, I love those three are relatable and inspiring. So thank you for that.
Sure, Jay.
I can personally identify with them. Yeah, what's it like to help people now? How does it, what does it feel like? What, as the one that can give, because things have been taken and you rebuilt. What's it feel like to help people?
I I bet you that first of all, I think there's a ton of data that being of service to others leads, feeling like you're of service to others leads to the greatest sense of leading a life worth living versus anything else. So
Wow.
you say, I'm happy. You then have to say, define happiness. And there's sort of what they call the hedonic definition, hedonism, right? Which is, how am I feeling right now? Oh my God, it feels great to get my foot massaged. Or I'm in the middle of a yoga class and my quads just opened up, or my lower back feels great, right? That's in this moment, right? And then there's, how am I feeling about the life I'm leading? How satisfied am I with my life? And sometimes that's you drive up in your driveway and you realize, hey, I've paid off my house and I feel great about owning my house outright. Or we just released a new product and I think it's great. Or this podcast is getting incredibly popular and this woman came up to me and said, I love your podcast. I've seen everyone, and you feel good about what you've accomplished. And it might also feel good in the moment, but it's bigger because it's like I'm doing something good with my life, right? The thing that makes people feel most satisfied with their life is feeling like they've been of service to others. And the layup for doing that usually is to have kids and feel like you've been a good parent, right? And that you're working at being a good parent. So one of the things that can happen is early childhood, your hedonistic evaluation, if you take an exam and are asked, and they've done this every 15 minutes, scale of 1 to 10, how you feeling right now? It goes way down versus earlier, like, right? Just being a swinging 20 something. But how you feeling about your life goes way up, right? So anyway, being of service to others is clearly deeply meaningful. And then kind of metavacing over the stuff from positive psychology, the acronym that was sort of popularized and essentially invented by famous psychologist Martin Seligman of the University of Pennsylvania is PERMA, which stands for positive emotions, engagement, as in the sense of flow, relationships, meaning, and achievement, right? So that's what PERMA stands for. I like to argue meaning really flows from one of three things, as far as I can tell. Now, this is Rob McCord, not Martin Seligman. I think it stands for either this is how I want to serve others, or second, this is what I like to create. So I've been around people who need to create art or need to create a garden, right? They just need to. They don't care if other people use the garden. They're not creating the garden because it's good for the environment and it's filled with native plants. They're not just doing it because it's nature therapy for them. There's something about creating the garden, or they're musicians. They need to create the music, or they're painters or sculptors. My mother wanted to create new knowledge. I mean, she was just driven to do great research that created new knowledge. I was the one who said, "Well, but how do you port that over to influence policymakers?" And she was like, "Well, that's for somebody else to do," which was interesting. I mean, it was instructive. So to be create, what do you want to create, or how do you want to be of service to others? And obviously, those can be a Venn diagram. You might say, "I love creating music," but I also one reason for that is it gives others pleasure. And then I think religion unto itself is another one, right? Um, because there are people who say, well, I do this to serve Allah, or I do this because the Torah calls on it, or I do this because this is what Jesus would want. And it's not necessarily identical. You know, if you're going to mass, you aren't necessarily going to mass to be of service to others, but you might give you a great sense of meaning. Now, I'm more of a secular Jewish Unitarian, so I'm more way over on the be of service gives me that sense of meaning. And I find myself arguing a little with the more conservative Catholic, frankly, Republican leaning, guy who's been at Harvard Business School and he was head of AEI. And he's like, this sense of meaning, it really comes from work. You need to have work and faith and family and this and that. But then he'll admit, well, family, you can either have a loved one or a close friend. And I'm like, well, okay, that's not family, dude. And think how many single people are aging out and you just oppress them. And when you say work, it's like, well, the only system that works is capitalism. And I'm like, yeah, except that people are happier in Sweden and Denmark than they are in the US and Hong Kong, right? Which are wildly capitalistic. So on a continuum. And he said, well, that's because, in capitalism, you earn your success. It's like, well, no, I've run into people worth a couple $100 million and they were running tobacco companies or Pepsi Cola that poison people for a living. They didn't earn their money. They made money, and our market signals rewarded them, but they made money off of addiction, not off of the expression of a legitimate need. It was kind of a pharmacologically created addiction. Now, I love capitalism. I'm a capitalist. I'm market oriented. I think I share with a lot of my secular Jewish, ancestors this like I love doing deals, I love market signals, but that doesn't mean I think a free market gets absolutely everything right. So this Heritage Foundation guy is acting like we rich people, we've got it right. And that's why life is so good for us. And I'm like, dude, you are under accounting for luck. And I do think attitudes and being focused on being of service to others is overwhelmingly valuable. And it's particularly valuable to people who might never be financially rich.
How important is it to question assumptions?
You know, I,
Yeah,
it's
seems like you do that. That's why I
that's a well-phrased question because you're saying how important on a scale of 1 to 10. I think the answer is really it depends. I think I was raised
like that.
with two family religions. One was to be pro-civil rights, and the other was to be pro-skepticism and scholarship, right? So I, as a religious tenant, have to challenge assumptions. But I watch the average Mormon, let's say, who seems to me to be productive and happy, let's say, maybe average, I don't know average, but I've certainly call it Mitt Romney, right? He's hugely accomplished. Now, I don't think he spent a lot of time really saying, how probable is it that this guy who, wanted to have sex with multiple women and, pretended he found tablets in northern New York, how probable is it that that really happened? I think he doesn't question that assumption. And it served him very well to never question that assumption. I think he's a phenomenally good and accomplished man. I mean, he'll use the word sport when he should use the word athlete. He might use the word binders of women at an awkward time. I think Obama was a great president, but I think Mitt Romney could have been a great president. Really a great president, honestly, right? So I sit there and say, he obviously doesn't question assumptions in certain lanes, right? Um, but that might have served him very well. So when you say how important is it?
When we
Yeah, but
face
I'm like, when you get
adversity,
a healthcare influencer, yes, I do think you need to question. You need to go, what is this influencer getting paid for, by? right? So when you say, okay, he's just summarized this research and it has nothing to do with what he's trying to sell me, I have less skepticism than when he's making a bunch of assertions and he says, and oh, by the way, I have this product I'm associated with. Does that make some sense?
I love it, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on when we, from a positive psychology standpoint and a resilience perspective, when we face true adversities, do those adversities undermine our assumptions? Do they destroy, do they obliterate our assumptions in a sense, or put us in this position to that we need new standing? That I never thought of this ever before in this way before this episode.
I think what always happens when really awful things happen to you is you're reminded of the stuff you took for granted, right?
Oh,
So, I mean, I remember being state treasurer and I was trying to learn to kiteboard and I went to Long Beach, LBI, and had a great kiteboarding lesson. And LBI has like this long strip of land where you're supposed to drive 25 miles an hour. Now, like I'm going there in October. There's literally, I don't see another car. I was going 40, but it was, wide road, no cars, totally safe. I just didn't know it was a 25-mile-an-hour zone. And I get pulled over, I get given a ticket. I have to go back there. I plead guilty, but I say, Your Honor, I just had no idea. I just hope I can just pay a fee and do whatever. I just don't want to, if you could give me something where my insurance rate doesn't go up, because then I'll be paying for 5 years. And I really wasn't driving recklessly. And he said, no problem, $400 and da 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 da. And he's great. He's funny. I don't feel shamed. And the police officer comes over to me and says, "Oh, I don't think he called me Your Honor. Oh, Honorable Treasurer McCord. If you had told me you were the state treasurer, I mean, I would have let you go. You should have called me, told me you were treasurer." I walked away from that thinking, yeah, I'm a little uncomfortable being pulled over by a cop and saying I'm the state treasurer. But I was taking totally for granted as an affluent looking white guy that I could go into a court of law and they'd work with me, right? All of a sudden, I have the FBI and the assistant U.S. attorney. And the assistant U.S. attorney says, "We know you're a good guy. We know you were a good treasurer. We know you didn't know you were breaking the law. But 100 out of 100 times we'd prosecute you for this." I even had one of the secretary, the U.S. attorney saying, "You don't eavesdrop on 2,000 phone calls without getting to know somebody." And I got a sense of, how hard you work to be a good guy. But Rob, we are prosecuting you. And then I realized they're prosecuting me to get the leverage to use me on other people. So they are pushing me hard. Yes, they think to get more just outcomes. I think to further their career. And what I was prosecuted for was extortion with threat of economic harm with reference to public office. But they knew I wasn't trying to raise money for myself. I wasn't soliciting a bribe. I didn't know I was breaking the law. I'll tell you more detail in a second. I was just trying to further my political career. And I was saying, well, here's a talking point. But now, with the benefit of hindsight, I realized I made a mistake. I was using abusive language. I was abusing my power to get to prosper professionally. Well, guess what? You should never say this. It should always be black and white. I did horrible. I was addicted to crack cocaine. I was a horrible man. Now I've recovered. No, I believe in a world of gray. I made a mistake. I was overly pushy, right? But I believe the prosecutor and the FBI abused their power to promote their career because they get rewarded for prosecutions when they've spent a lot of money. And they'd spent money tape recording me 2,200 times and hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of those calls. It was actually shown that I was going out of my way to not break the law. Somebody would say, well, I know I'm not allowed to give money to you, but I can encourage so and so. And I would say, no, you can't do indirectly what you're not allowed to do directly, right? I just didn't know. So the specifics of
wow.
my case is I'm talking to a lawyer. Let's say you're a lawyer, Jay, and you have a boss who's named John. And I'd say, Jay, John said he'd raise me 100 grand. I get it. I only put in 2 million of my own money. Tom Wolfe, who later became governor, he's put in 12. Now I'm behind in the polls. He thinks I'm going to lose. But, he said he'd raise 100 grand. Now he's not even returning my phone calls. And you, Jay, say, yeah, he's an ass, whatever, right? I don't want to violate whatever code we have here about
Sure.
cursing. And I said, well, can you remind him we're friends and neighbors, and that like I helped your daughter, with squash and the sport and getting into Penn and stuff. And he goes, Rob, he could care less that we're friends. All he cares about are billables. And I said, well, okay, Jay, listen, and I know I'll keep you as my lawyer for this sleeve of private equity deals. I'd known this guy from way back when I was a VC, used him for years. You're great at what you do, but if it works, feel free to say, Rob was a good client when he was a venture capitalist. Even if he loses his primary, and I know that's what you think is going to happen, he'll still be state treasurer. He'll still be the effing state treasurer for 2 more years. And then he'll go back into private equity and he can be a good client again then. And we don't want to F with a client. So I'd said, I'll still be the effing state treasurer and we don't want to F with the client. And my lawyer said the curse word, the F word, and the fact that you refer to the fact that you'll still be the effing state treasurer makes you guilty of the Hobbs Act violation, which is extortion with threat of economic harm with reference to public office. Then I'm sitting on the balls of my butt in prison. I'd only let myself watch TV for about 2 hours and I'd watch half an hour of news most nights. And I'm watching, and they're talking about how Trump has been impeached because he said to Zelensky, yes, Congress said you can have these weapons, but I'm withholding them until you do me a political favor. You got to help me out here. You got to go on CNN and say the Bidens are corrupt in the following way. You got to help me out a little, and then I'll get those weapons to you. And I'm sitting there going, wait a minute, that's extortion with threat of economic harm with reference to public office. And he doesn't say, Jay, and I know I'm only kidding, or this is just a talking point or a bluff. And the majority of the US Senate says he didn't commit a crime. And I'm like, if he didn't commit a crime, why am I sitting in here in jail, in prison, right? So it's hard for me because I
I
know
have a
I made mistakes. I don't think they should have been felonies. And I don't quite know how to, that's a part of my pain that I still haven't fully recovered from. So I'm being authentic with you in thinking
yeah.
aloud about it, you
I
know?
think it's deeply help. Well, first of all, deeply helpful because I actually have a question about labels. Like I wrote this down earlier. What is it? What is a felon? And then are is one a felon having done something that could be considered such? Like, or it could one be one who did something and then that action was considered that, meaning the label, right? Like
Yeah.
or
Well,
did
I mean, let's not
so.
get too far in the weeds because my guess is 99.9% of the people listening to you are not felons. So
Well,
we're not going to have to
I,
worry about it.
I, I don't know. Maybe
The
that's
quick,
not true.
oh,
Maybe
really?
it's 10%. Maybe it's
Yeah, okay.
10%
Well, a
of
couple
the
couple quick
population.
things.
So
And
like,
I should wrap up relatively soon here, but couple quick things. Felony is there's just a set of laws that you break, and they're federal. They're federal. They're not state. So you can commit a murder and have it just be a state crime, if I understand correctly, versus something that's a felony or it's only a misdemeanor. And I am not an attorney and I don't play one on TV. I didn't even graduate from the Law and Order School of Law, even though I watch too many TV shows. So the point, I just was told, oh, by the way, that's why, the FBI was probably trying to go after Governor Rendell. Um, they had rolled up Governor Rendell's, this is what I
let,
learned.
let me say it this way.
Yeah,
I think the label to so I think there must be so much power in the label, right?
right.
Labels are for other people. At what level do they serve us? And I'd say I'm going to re-listen to this conversation a couple times because it's helped me today with so many late I just that's what I you know Labels are very powerful things. It's like when I have people on the show that say, a lot of leaders, maybe you could just speak to this as we close for the entrepreneurs. Like I'll often find entrepreneurs that say, I don't want a title, right? They're in a position of an org chart and they'll say, I don't need a title. And I always say, it's not for you, it's for everybody else.
Right,
And now, why is it for anybody else? Because they're looking to pay attention to. They need to know where are we going, who's in charge.
right, right.
So what I learned today was like, I mean, so much today. I want to release it a couple times of the power of reinvention, the power of purpose. But it's like I don't from this conversation alone as a student to you, beyond outside of this, um, I don't feel like I'm talking to whatever that word means.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
like been coached live today by a
Well,
deeply
I mean,
passionate,
I think it's kind of
insightful.
useful because then you can come up. Well, like it's one reason why we refer to enslaved people and we don't say slaves anymore, right? Because there was something derisive. No, these people were victims. They were human beings and they were enslaved. Like, let's use language more carefully. Conversely, you can say he's a felon. I remember there's a guy I actually have some respect for, a guy named Bob Asher in Pennsylvania. They'd say he's a felon, and Tom Ridge accepted support from him. And I'm like, have you actually heard? I mean, basically, I don't think Bob Asher did much wrong, and I can go into that. But you get to know some people, and you go, okay, just because somebody was caught speeding doesn't mean they're a chronically dangerous driver, right? Now,
Yeah, like your
that's some
true
NFL
power.
guy who's caught on his third ticket going 120 miles an hour. You might say, okay, this guy has a problem. So it could be some of these bad labels are warning signs. One of the things I coach a lot of people who are criminal justice system involved to do is do in politics. There's a phrase um, that Chris Matthews, who got himself in trouble later, but I loved he popularized it, called "Hang a Lantern on Your Weakness." And what so I say to people, look, I'm a felon, and because of that, I have to be extra careful. I can't get anywhere near the chalk lines. The last thing in the world I want to do is get anywhere near something that would get me in any kind of legal trouble or anybody. I want people to know that I am looking for redemption through service to others and through fidelity to my partners. And I did have some partners out of Pennsylvania say, hey, you always made us a boatload of money. You have a good nose for money. We want to invest with you again. And that's part of how we formed Sailfish Real Estate Capital and able to own a hotel and a bunch of other properties because people were like, you were always a great guy. Like there's even when I actually read the article, you didn't, you weren't taking a bribe, you weren't knowingly breaking the law. But I wasn't allowed to say that because I had to suck up to the prosecutor for 4 years in order to try to get a minimal sentence. And even then, I got in a fight with them because they were accusing other guys of attempted bribery. And I was like, they didn't commit attempted bribery. There was never a quid pro quo. And they said, just get on the stand and tell the truth. And I told the truth. And the defense lawyer said, was there a quid pro quo? And I said, no, because I wanted the judge to know I wasn't open to bribes. But the judge got pissed because he's like, you should have been sucking up to the prosecutors and you didn't even try. And I'm like, all I did was tell the whole truth. And I'm pretty, and that guy dismissed the case. And I'm pretty sure that judge had enjoyed substantial financial support from the guys he let off. He later went on to be president of Dickinson College. I'll bet you he got major contributions to Dickinson College from those same guys, So it's a weird world. And that is, you were asking about unusual context. Sometimes with politicians, the phrase is he gets the joke. Like, what's really going on here? Bill Clinton had to suck up to the
All
chicken
right,
industry to
this is
get elected as governor again after he lost the first time.
well, something I've learned from company culture is the most honest person in the room with the least that's least with least control is will be destroyed by the organization. They'll either quit and find a better organization or they'll
Wow.
be pariahed out. And so I'm talking to an honest man today right? Because Meaning that's why I think I was like the label, because I'm triggered in a positive way to somebody I care about, somebody I learn from. That
Yeah,
like, you know what I'm saying? One of the things I like about you most, Rob, is that you've always been so honest and so clear. And one thing I'm taking away from this conversation is like, yeah, the more on, yeah, the truth. Yeah, the truth will set you free isn't necessarily a freedom that we might easily contend with.
yeah,
Like, oh yeah, everything's gonna be rainbows. No,
yeah.
it's gonna be yeah. So
And,
that's the
and I
point
mean, I
that
do think some of it is to be appropriately humble. I mean, I was flawed. I mean, I think I spent too much time fundraising. I was too aggressive fundraising. I didn't knowingly commit a felony. The guy who, it's not public, but Ed Rendell's former chief of staff, John Estey, was apparently the guy who was pointing at me. I actually liked John, even though he wore a wire on me and all this. It's like, I get it. He didn't want to spend the rest, he didn't want to spend a decade in prison. So he went around wearing a wire on a bunch of Democrats, right? I find that really forgivable. I can empathize with that because of the box you're put into, right? And I it's interesting. The other word I would really emphasize for a lot of people, and this is with the benefit of gray hair and older age, is the word intention, right? I do think, I mean, it mattered to me that I intended to try to get into Harvard, Princeton, or Yale starting when I was 15. That shaped it mattered to me that I intended to do a lot of good when I was on Capitol Hill and to work with the best of the best on issues like climate change, right? And that I always wanted to fight for civil rights the way my father had when he stood guard outside a black church with Barney Frank. And then, when I had my downfall, my intention was like to own what I did wrong. But the part that is still hard for me is I didn't get to talk about what I thought the justice system was doing wrong, right?
Mm.
And similarly, now my son has died and he made some mistakes. And Lord knows I made mistakes. And whenever your son, something like that happens, you have parental guilt, I've noticed. Even that, so it's very easy to comfort somebody else and then you realize the guilt you have. Um, but I also sit there and say, there was a toxic brew. I mean, when he went to Dartmouth, think about the pro-drinking culture there. When he was in comedy and improv, think about the pro-drug late night culture. When we're on these screens, I mean, I think he was addicted to screen time. So Grant was, I'll send you the video of like his celebration of life. He was an absolute genius, and he was one of the most lovable people you could imagine. But there were a bunch of toxic forces at play. If he had just grown up on a farm and was working as a farmer, he'd be the best storytelling farmer in the state, and he'd be getting up at dawn and he'd be alive today, right? I mean, our modern civilization created a context for him that didn't work, right? It's always multifactorial. But anyway, so for the viewers, it starts with intention, right? So I love working as an executive coach with people who've already been through psychotherapy. And I'm like, we're not here to analyze why what's wrong is wrong. We're here to start with what are your values? What are your
Wow.
intentions? How do we make progress? And that I've loved doing that work.
Well, your life example is inspiring, Rob, and I can't wait for you to come back in the show. I we love to do this again, part one of 10.
Yeah, sounds great.
I'm
And I
very
gotta
excited
visit, I
and
gotta
interested.
visit you down in Naples one of these days in the right time of year.
Well,
And you gotta come stay. Look, we have a great hotel, the Oceaneer Hotel in Carolina Beach.
yes,
We have a mansion with 6 condos in it. The one of my
yes.
big friends, Chase Lenfest, he's turbocharged a bunch of things. He's gotten me interested in purpose-built communities. I would encourage you to get involved in that. And this whole resilience turnaround movement in and around positive psychology. Would welcome anybody who's interested in any of those things.
I think if our listeners, it's either episode 49 or 51 or something around that, is go listen to that after this. That's Chase's first time on the show. And I will see you down there soon, sooner than later. And well, next time we do this, then it'll be in the studio at our house in
Oh,
Naples.
that sounds great.
That's what we'll have to do. If you're listening to this episode, Rob, what's the fastest way that someone can? I know people listening want to talk to you, connect with you. How can they get
I think
connecting.
for now, just shoot me an email. I mean, they could look up the Oceaneer, et cetera, the hotel, but shoot me a personal email at rmccord1279 at gmail.com. So again, rmccord1279 at
Perfect.
gmail.com.
If you're listening to this episode, share this with someone you care about that needs to hear it. Please leave us a review on the Culture Matters podcast, and we will see you next time. Thank you, my friend.
Sounds great, Jay. Thanks for everything. Have a good one.